Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Thom Hartmann to discuss the hidden history of American oligarchy, reclaiming our democracy from the ruling class. A look at the history of the battle against oligarchy in America and how we can win the latest round. Thom Hartmann is a four-time winner of the Project Censored Award, a New York Times bestselling author of 32 books, and America's #1 progressive talk radio show host. His show is syndicated on local, for-profit, and nonprofit stations and broadcast nationwide and worldwide. It is also simulcast on television into nearly 60 million US and Canadian homes. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by David Korten. David is co-founder of Yes Magazine, president of the Living Economies Forum, and a member of the Club of Rome. He writes a regular column for Yes and is the author of numerous books, including the international bestseller, When Corporations Rule the World. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Hidden History of American Oligarchy from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Whoops.
Hey, it works. It's magic.
Yeah, I'm not seeing myself.
David just vanished. There you go.
Can you see me? Because I can't see myself.
I see you just fine, David.
We can see you.
Okay, that's all that matters. Oh, come on. I'm losing my notes. Whoops. Anyhow, Thom, it is great to be here with you. We have such a long and wonderful friendship, and I must say I'm absolutely fascinated by this book, and I am. I find the deeper we go in our conversations about it, the more fascinating I become in what I'm learning. So I think our main thing to start out with right now is you're going to give us a little overview of the book and I guess why you wrote it and what you think are the most important conclusions that you've come to, and then we'll talk a little bit about the current implications for current politics.
Great.
So,
thank you, David.
Go with it.
And it's great to be back here with you, David. A brilliant mind, a good friend, an extraordinary author. Your work is must read for anybody who's watching this. I wrote this book as kind of a bookend to the book that preceded it, which was The Hidden History of Monopoly. And monopoly is when actors in the economic arena accumulate so much wealth and power that they can monopolize markets and prevent competition. Oligarchy is the same thing applied to politics. It's when a small number of political actors, typically very wealthy, occasionally they're not, but when they're not, they're in the service of those who are very wealthy, which you see, for example, in our Congress right now, and monopolize essentially or control the political sphere. The principal characteristic that identifies or that tells you that a country has gone from being a democracy to an oligarchy is when it ceases to work for the demos, for the people. In other words, when legislation that is passed has little connection to what the majority of the people actually want to happen, that you can measure with public opinion polls and things like that. But instead, the majority of legislation and government activity is directed toward enriching or maintaining the riches of the oligarchs and satisfying their particular political desires or idiosyncrasies. And we're there in the United States right now. Back in about 10 years ago, in 2010, for the first time since the 1950s, fewer than half of Americans are what would be called middle class. This is the result of a 40-year, very aggressive program that we refer to as the Reagan Revolution, of gutting the middle class. And I'm guessing we'll probably talk about this a little later, David, but yep. That was kicked off by Russell Kirk and Ronald Reagan, frankly, with what may well be the very best of intentions, which is a whole fascinating story. Why would they want to gut the middle class? But here we are. And Gillens and Page, Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page of Northwestern and Princeton did this remarkable study that was published a few years ago, in which they found that before the Reagan Revolution, what the majority of Americans actually wanted, what you could measure in public opinion polls when you said, well, out of public policy, out of government, what would you like? And people would say, well, I want this, this, and this. And the 9 times out of 10, well, not literally, but a significant and measurable majority of the time, those public desires were translated into public policy. And that's how just in the 60s, for example, and the 70s, we got Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, long-term unemployment insurance, the Environmental Protection Agency, the strengthening of our protections, consumer protections and things like that, food stamps, Pell Grants, and other kinds of college support, brand new hospitals built all across the United States, brand new public schools built all across the United States. A little earlier, the Eisenhower interstate highway system that kicked off a massive boom in small business and general economies. All of these things came about because the majority of the people wanted them. If you look at what's happened since the Reagan Revolution, basically post 1990, really, it took a few years for the Reagan Revolution to really bite hard. What you find is that by the year 2000, that once very, very measurable connection between what the majority of people wanted and what Congress did was completely broken. In fact, Gillens and Page identified the association, the mathematical association between what people want post-2000 and what actually happens from Congress as being equivalent to random noise. Statistically, there is no connection any longer. However, what the oligarchs want prior to the Reagan Revolution only occasionally got made into law. Post-Reagan Revolution, it's pretty much the only thing that gets made into law. For example, the only consequential legislative accomplishment of the entire 4 years of the Trump administration was what was sold as a $1.5 trillion tax cut for billionaires. Turns out it's more like $2 trillion, but for billionaires and big corporations. And that was pretty much it. You got a lot of deregulation stuff through executive action. The crisis for us, out of the fact that for 20 years now we have been an oligarchy, and a functioning oligarchy instead of a functioning democracy. And the thing that provoked me to write this book that really concerns me, and I think one of the main points I want to make in the book, or I do make in the book, is that oligarchies are inherently unstable. They're unstable because they're not popular government. People aren't getting what they want. And as a consequence, people tend to, in oligarchies tend to go one of two directions, two things. Number one, they tend to go one of two directions. Either they are taken back by the people, and this has happened twice in American history, once in the 1860s when we fought back the oligarchy that had arisen in the South, and in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the oligarchs. Or the oligarchs decide they're not going to let go. They're going to hang on to the political power they have, and they're going to crush dissent. And in that case, the oligarchy becomes a police state. And that's the path that we were rapidly traveling under the Trump administration, and frankly, where I think we'd be right now if Donald Trump had been able to hang on to the White House. I think that probably this year or next, David, you and I would be on the list of people to be put in prison, because that's one of the first things. Oligarchs, when they're in the oligarchy phase and preparing on the trajectory toward tyranny, one of the most common things that they do, and you see this from from Trotsky and Stalin through Hitler and Mussolini to Pinochet to Donald Trump, is that they identify the press as, quote, the enemy of the people, and they start aggressive campaigns to destroy the press. And then once they seize police power, they start imprisoning or executing the press. And it's a major crisis all over the world in countries that were formerly democracies like Hungary that now are tyrannies, and media figures are just rotting in jail. So, we dodged that bullet, sort of. But the oligarchs haven't gone away. The oligarchy has not been deconstructed. And we're just 1 or 2 elections away from being right back where we were just 4 or 5 months ago. And that's what concerns me so much. And that's why I wrote the book.
Fascinating. One of the things that has particularly fascinated me as we've gotten into this conversation is that we're both very fearful about the situation and fearful about the future. But the thing we're focused on is actually quite different. I think, as you know, the piece that most fascinates me about your construction of oligarchy and the relationship to democracy is that in my work on the human future and the path that we're on, essentially towards self-extinction as we move toward ever more extreme inequality of a concentration of wealth and the exclusion of the majority of people from a basic means of living, at the same time as we're destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life. And in the discussions I'm in, part of what comes out of this is that if we're to have a human future, we actually have to make a transition to democracy that is far deeper than anything that we have ever had before, in terms of people living in the community, in the place where they live, meeting their essential needs, finding spiritual fulfillment, essentially becoming fully human as we understand that, but doing it in ways that are restorative of health's regenerative systems rather than destructive of them. And so that requires this move from oligarchy to true and deep democracy. You who are much more directly connected into the current politics and who have this extraordinary grasp of history are most particularly concerned at the moment about our slipping further into absolute tyranny, which of course would, that to me, that would be the end of the human species, because it's exactly the opposite of the direction we need to go. Now, you're really making a very radical statement here that Trump and particularly the Republican Party are intentionally trying to flip us from oligarchy into total tyranny. What do you see as, what do we need to know about the strategy by which they're doing that? If that is in fact the intention, let's put ourselves in their position, how do you convince people to go along with something that is so contrary to their actual interest?
Yeah. I think we need to understand the evolution, how we got here, and how the Republican Party has gone through a couple of substantial morphines or transitions. So let's start at the beginning, not the beginning of the Republican Party, but the modern era. In 1951, ironically, the year I was born, Russell Kirk published a book called The Conservative Mind. And in that book, Russell Kirk argued that if the middle class continued to grow as rapidly as it was, and keep in mind, in 1951, the bottom 90% were getting richer. In other words, their wealth, their accumulated wealth, things like buying homes and things, and their income was going up, at a rate that was faster than the top 5%. The wealthy were getting wealthy, but they weren't getting wealthy as fast as was the middle class, and even the edges of the middle class. And Kirk suggested, and this was unprecedented in human history, we were building a middle class like the world had never seen before. And Kirk proposed that if, based on really kind of a Thomas Hobbes view of humanity, that people are essentially evil, they'll grab whatever they can, you can't trust them, the masses, what John Adams referred to as the rabble, can't be really trusted with all the gears of democracy. And we certainly saw that in the last 2 years of the Adams presidency, which is a whole nother story, a fascinating one, but a whole nother story. I wrote a book about it called We the People. But anyhow, Kirk said, if this wealth of the middle class continues to grow, if the middle class continues to get richer and richer and richer, they're going to hit a point where they don't need us anymore, where they don't need the constraints of society. See, Hobbes had suggested that in man's natural state, saying man's using his language, in man's natural state, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. And the reason why is because without the Leviathan, which was the title of his 1651 book, without the Leviathan of church or state, and in the book he describes it as the iron fist of church or state, to constrain our human behavior, then we revert to our natural state and life becomes nasty, brutish, and short. And so Kirk was seeing that. He was predicting that. He was saying in 1951, if the middle class gets wealthier, a couple of very specific things are going to happen. Young people are going to stop being respectful of their elders, and that is going to cause a generational disintegration of society. Women are going to decide that they no longer have the traditional place in the household that has existed for thousands of years, and they're going to demand equality with men. And that can be a sudden and destabilizing influence in society that could throw our culture into absolute chaos. Minorities are going to start demanding equality, and not slowly or gradually, the way that conservatives agree that it might be appropriate, but instantly. And that's going to lead to literally cities on fire. And so he laid this out, and he said, "This is what," and other minorities are going to, be not just racial minorities, but gender minority, gay people and things like that are going to be right in there with that. When he published that book, it really caught fire in a very small number of people. Barry Goldwater was just, it changed Barry Goldwater's life and put him on a trajectory to run for president in '64. It got Everett Dirksen all excited. It became the foundation of William F. Buckley's worldview. But that was kind of the conservative intelligentsia. The rest of the conservative movement, the Republican Party, just thought Russell Kirk was a crank. And then came the 1960s, a decade later, and Kirk was still around. And in 1961, the birth control pill was legalized. By 1963, it was in wide use. By 1964 and 65, you had the beginnings of a women's rights movement, a real substantial women's rights movement. The so-called bra burning that was the big deal in 65. And by 66, you had a strong anti-war movement going on. Plus, in 65, psychedelics got out of the lab and into the hands of young people on college campuses. And so by 66, 67, you had young people burning draft cards and saying, hell no, I won't go, and growing their hair out and having sex everywhere all the time. And just as Russell Kirk had predicted. And you had this huge movement that was led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but not just that. You had Malcolm X, and you had the Black Panthers, and you had all these groups. And by the late 60s, our cities were on fire. And at that point, these conservative Republicans looked around and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was absolutely right. And if we don't do something about this, America is going to cease to be America. America is going to go down in flames. It'll be the end of the experiment. The Soviets will just march in and take us over, or somebody else, because we will be so vulnerable, because we'll be in such chaos, because we'll be fighting with each other, and our cities will be on fire, and our kids won't join the military, and et cetera, et cetera. So two things happened out of that. The first was that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce commissioned a tobacco lawyer named Lewis Powell to write a a blueprint, a proposal for how to get control of America again, how the top 5% could get control of America again, and thus stabilize this country that was spinning out of control, which is how they viewed it. And in fact, when you read Lewis Powell's 1971 memo, it's fascinating. The whole preamble to it, the first page or two, he identifies Ralph Nader, who had published Unsafe at Any Speed in 1966, and Rachel Carson, who in 1967 had published Silent Spring. He identifies them in their books by name and says that this consumer movement and this environmental movement, this is the leading vanguard of communism and socialism that are going to bring down the American free enterprise system. So it's not just our society that's going to go down in flames, it's our economy as well. And so, and then he lays out, we need to take control of the media. We need to get our rich friends buying radio and television stations. We take control of the universities. We need to start sponsoring college professors in political science, history, and economics classes. By the way, there's over 200 universities now that have people who are sponsored by people from, billionaires, mostly from the Koch network. We need to take control of the textbooks in the high schools, and particularly with regard to civics and history. We need to build think tanks that will, project our ideas out and publish op-eds and things like that. And thus, in the early 70s, we got the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and the Economic Policy Institute, or the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and all these other right-wing groups. And we need to build a new generation of politicians, and perhaps most importantly, we need to seize control of the judiciary. And thus was born brain fart. The group that has been vetting judges for Donald Trump, and the Federalist Society. So all of this came about in the early 70s, and then in 72, Nixon put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court. And in 76, the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of the United States, said, in the decision called Buckley versus Vallejo, said that when billionaires own politicians, if a politician literally owes their political career to a single billionaire, and they dance to that tune, they sponsor legislation that will benefit that billionaire or his business. We used to call that bribery and political corruption. It used to be illegal. This was in particular in the wake of the Nixon bribery scandals. There had been numerous laws passed in 74 and 75 about this, but it dated all the way back to 1907 with Teddy Roosevelt's Tillman Act that made it a federal felony for a corporation to sponsor any politician at the federal level. So anyhow, the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to call that bribery or corruption anymore. We're going to call that speech. That money is not money, it's speech. And speech is protected under the First Amendment, and political speech is the most protected. So no problem. Billionaires, buy your politicians. And then 2 years later, in a decision that was actually written by Lewis Powell himself, First National Bank versus Bellotti, the court extended that logic to corporations. This opened a floodgate of money into the Republican Party. The Democrats were already very well funded by the unions, by working people across the United States through their union dues. But the Republican Party had been relying on business, and this just opened this absolute floodgate for them that Ronald Reagan coasted into the White House in 1981 with. And thus, Reagan's principal charge from the Buckleys and the Kirks and the Goldwaters of the world who were, guiding this thing, and of course, the very wealthy billionaires who were, the Scaifes and Richard Mellon Scaife and Joe Coors and his friends. His principal mission was to dial back the wealth of this middle class because they were out of control and it was going to destroy the United States. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So, and from Reagan's point of view, it was a twofer because the principal funding source for the Democratic Party, which he saw as enemy, was unions. And so he declared war on unions. In 1 week, he took down Patco and destroyed that union. It had taken Maggie Thatcher 6 months to destroy the coal union, coal miners union 2 years earlier in the UK, the largest and most powerful union there. And he declared war on unions. He brought in Ray Donovan, an anti-union guy to run the Labor Department. First time that had ever happened in the history of the United States since the Labor Department had been created in the 1930s with the Wagner Act. He got the Supreme Court on board with a series of labor hostile decisions. And so by 1992, by the end of the Reagan presidency, or Reagan Bush presidency, Bill Clinton could no longer get enough money from the unions to run for president. He had to go, he and Al Fromm created this new thing called the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, specifically to raise money from corporations. But they decided, we will take money from good corporations. None of that steel money or oil money. We're going to take money from the banks and the insurance companies. They're good corporations. And, which put us on this whole neoliberal path. So we go from trying to stabilize society, predicting society was going to fall apart, watching society in turmoil, thinking this was a bad thing. I would view it as a good thing. Liberals view society generally in turmoil as the birth pains of something new. That's not how conservatives view it, right? They view it as everything's going to hell. So we go from that to Reagan saying, okay, we're going to strip the wealth of the middle class, and in the process, we're going to also strip the Democratic Party. Keep in mind, at that point in time, the Republican Party had only held the U.S. House of Representatives once for 2 years since 1932. That's how unpopular the idea of a party that was just loyal to billionaires was. And so, that happened, and increasingly throughout the Reagan Revolution, the people who were calling the shots were not the politicians, and they definitely weren't the people. They were the funders of the Republican Party that had been facilitated by these two Supreme Court decisions, the billionaire class, basically, what today we would refer to as the billionaire class. And among them, you had a bunch of ideologues who just flat out did not believe in democracy. People who felt that democracy was messy, democracy was confusing, democracy was dangerous. You really, kind of this neo-Calvinism. You really need, some technocrats and rich people running the show. And to some extent, Bill Clinton bought right into this. The era of big government is over, and brought in, people like Jamie Dimon and Lawrence Summers, who are very much of that mind. We are the elite and we should run the world. And that then put us on a path to people not getting what they wanted out of the Clinton administration, out of the Bush administration, or out of the Obama administration. And because the billionaires are running the show, as Gillens and Page had identified. And that then set the stage for a phony populist, Donald Trump, to come in and steal Bernie Sanders' genuine populist platform and say, I'm going to run for president and I'm going to raise taxes on rich people. Remember Donald Trump saying, I'm going to get murdered. These new taxes are going to kill me. My friends are going to hate me, but hey, it's the right thing to do. Raise taxes on rich people. Use that money to pay for a national health care program that will cover everybody for less money than Obamacare. He absolutely promised that. And the 65,000 factories that were identified by the federal government, by the Federal Trade Commission, as having moved from the United States to other countries as a consequence of these, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and NAFTA, which were negotiated by Reagan and Bush, put in place by Clinton. But, this is where it all began. Those 65,000 factories, Trump said, I'm going to bring all those back to the United States. Now, he was lying through his teeth on all three counts and did not accomplish any of those three things. In fact, did the opposite in each one of those three categories. But people bought it thinking, okay, we're ready. And that opened.
I hesitate to do this
because come in. Sorry, David, go ahead.
This is absolutely fascinating, but we're going to run out of time.
Sorry.
And I think we need to move to get into some of the positive side of this. Now, you started this incredible rant with the discussion of assumptions about our human nature and the Hobbesian assumptions about who we are and what our possibilities are. And clearly we have a potential for this Hobbesian nature, which the oligarchs have been demonstrating, particularly the ones that are trying to take us to total tyranny. But you also referred to the, essentially the hippie generation and the kind of, we might call anarchists, which there is also a line of, in a sense, the total disorganization. And it's not clear to me. I mean, well, as you said, the anarchy may be useful as a transition point, but obviously we can't live with anarchy because we actually have to get some work done, and we have to grow our food, and we have to, do all the things that an organized society needs to do.
Right.
Now, in your book, on oligarchy, you actually talk about our evidence of our true nature, which is neither the oligarch or the anarchist, and that part of your book fits so beautifully into my own work and what we're learning at a deeper level about the nature of life and how life actually organizes. So why don't you say something about what you've learned about our true nature, which is what we have to recognize and embrace if we're going to move to a viable human future.
Sure. Yeah, this was the great debate in the 1600s. I mean, Hobbes brought two things forward, and one was the foundation of what today we would call liberal politics, and the other was the foundation of what today we would call conservative politics. Hobbes, as I said earlier, said that human nature was evil. But he also said that humans should be able to govern themselves, that we're smart enough, even though we're evil, we're smart enough, we should be able to figure out how to govern ourselves, which was blasphemy. I mean, Hobbes had been the tutor for King Charles I, and it was he was well embedded, inside the British royal system. But he said that, and it sparked an explosion. And then, 20, 30 years later, in the 1670s, I think it was 1671 or 74, John Locke published his second treatise on government, or his two treatises on government. And in that, he said, yeah, we can govern ourselves. And by the way, Hobbes was wrong. And by the way, he was the tutor to King James I. He said, no, the essential nature of humans is good. And he was loudly applauded in that by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher and anthropologist, who was paying very careful attention to the explorers who were discovering North and Western Africa and the East Coast and the northern parts of North America and South America. And they were discovering all these indigenous people on both the African and the American continents that were living in peace and harmony. Mm-hmm. And so this kicked off a 100-year debate from the 1670s to the 1770s about whether people could actually completely govern themselves. And Jefferson and Franklin and Adams, until he became president, and Paine and a whole bunch of the other people that we think of as the founders and framers, all came in on Locke and Rousseau's side, and thus created this country the way it is. Now, for the 200 years from then until now, there's been this huge debate about, well, aren't we, if we're animals, we're biologically animals, aren't we, like wolves, where there's a leader of the pack? Turns out we are animals, and we are like animals, but Kent Conrad and a fellow by the name of Roper, I can't remember his first name, did this remarkable study at I think it was East Anglia University, one of the universities in the UK. It's in my book, where they were looking at a nearby herd of red deer. And there's a couple of watering holes out there, and the deer have to figure out when to go drink. And if they go too early, then not everybody gets enough food. If they go too late, somebody might get dehydrated. I mean, these are actually life and death decisions. And with multiple watering holes, what if there's a predator at one of them? And what they found, putting cameras in the trees, was that the deer would, as they're grazing, would just at some point start all pointing not all of them, but one by one, they would start pointing their bodies toward one of the three watering holes. And when they hit 51% of the deer pointing to one particular watering hole, the entire herd would just coalesce around them, and boom, off they go to the watering hole. And interestingly, one of the things that the framers built into our Constitution is, like, for really big decisions, like amending the Constitution, you have to have a supermajority, 2/3. They found that if there was a predator in the area, it took a 2/3 majority of the deer to make a decision. but that is kind of setting that aside. So anyhow, I was fascinated by this. I read about it in Science or in Nature, and so I called up Kent Conrad in the UK, and I said, can I interview you for a book I'm writing? And this originally went into a book I wrote called What Would Jefferson Do? And he was like, yeah, sure. And so I said, well, what happened when you published this? I mean, you did the research, it's peer reviewed, it's been published, it's real. How unique is this to red deer? And what do you think the broader applications or implications are? And he said, it's just been crazy around here. He said, the bug guys called, the ichthyologists entomologists called me and they said, we're seeing this with swarming behavior, where you've got a ball of gnats in the air. We've all seen these in the summertime, and the entire ball of gnats just goes zoop, zoop. How does that happen? How do they know to do that? Well, it turns out if you do slow motion photography, and they were just really starting to get serious about this. This was about a decade ago, that each one of the bugs is like voting with their wing beats. And when they start, when 51% of them tilt, 3 degrees to the right, the whole group will go 3 degrees to the right, but it takes that 51%. We're saying the same thing with ants. We're saying it with bees. We're seeing it, just right across the board. We're seeing this with all kinds of insects. He said, and then the fish guys called me, the ichthyologists, and they said, this is how fish swarm. We're now figuring it out with every gill movement or every movement of their body or wag of their tail. Every fish in the school is voting. Do we go right, left, straight ahead, up, down? What do we do? And when 51% of them make a particular decision, they will move. And, we all thought it was telepathy or something, ESP. And then the bird people called and said, hey, you just explained flock behavior. And now we can explain why these birds move the way they do in the sky. And it turns out that this is almost universal. There are a few solitary species out there, but they are the rare exceptions that prove the rule. And we are part of that. Not part of the exception, but we are, part of that larger dynamic of democracy literally wired into our genes, which is one of the reasons why, as I said earlier, oligarchy is so unstable, because it's anti-democratic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we are obviously much more complicated than a swarm of birds, that the decisions we have to make are far more complicated. But I totally agree with you that the only way we can possibly do it is organizing as communities that recognize our interdependence and recognize that we are a community, which takes us to deep democracy. Now, from all the things that you've learned about oligarchy and its instability, what do you think are the most important lessons for what we need to do now? I mean, it's kind of a natural reaction to say, the Biden-Harris administration, what should they do? But I actually recognize that the deepest changes we need to make are ones that are actually so contrary to the oligarchic system that probably the fundamental leadership has to come from we the people, from the bottom up. But it starts necessarily with our thinking and understanding about what our possibilities are and what the measures are we need to take if we are to get to a future that works for all the people on a living earth. What have you learned from your research that you think is most important about the next steps and what we need to do?
Well, I think the reason why the Biden-Harris administration is now making, not just making peace with the progressive movement and the Sanders wing of the party, but openly embracing them, is because it's the first administration who came to power largely from the grassroots. Their campaign was funded by most of their campaign was funded by individual donations, small donations from literally millions and millions of people. And not just them, we're seeing this all across the country. This is how John Ossoff and Reverend Warnock got into the Senate too. It was small donations from individual people. And so the Democratic Party is now in the process of rejecting the neoliberalism of Clinton and what would have been the Gore administration had George W. Bush not had Jeb Bush not thrown 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls 2 weeks before the election, and et cetera. And the Obama administration, to a large extent, the Democratic Party is now in the process, and this administration certainly, of rejecting that kind of Lawrence Summers worldview of, we really need the rich to be happy, or else everything's going to be a mess. And they're starting to embrace what the people want. The biggest problem that we have right now is this continuing grip that the oligarchs, the billionaire class, and the big corporations, the big monopolistic corporations have on our political system. Virtually the entire Republican Party is now owned by, probably fewer than 1,000, probably fewer than 100, really, right-wing billionaires. And a good chunk of the Democratic Party is too, sadly, still. Although we see them, they're starting to drop like flies, like Joe Crowley, the third most powerful Democrat, taken out by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He was taking money from corporations. She wasn't. Hey, here's how we go. So the biggest job that we've got, David, is to get money out of politics. And H.R. 1, this first piece of legislation that Pelosi passed 2 years ago, and she intends to pass again, and there's a Senate bill, an equivalent Senate bill, SB 1, does that. The problem is, because they're not centered on the budget, they can't be passed. That can't be passed by reconciliation. It has to be passed through this. It has to get through the Senate with a majority vote, and the filibuster now requires 60 votes. The filibuster was started in the 1830s by John C. Calhoun as a way of blocking any conversation about abolition of slavery in the Senate. The House actually passed a law against discussing the abolition of slavery. In the Senate, the law that they passed was a Senate rule. It was called the filibuster. And it was used exclusively to block discussions of slavery right up until the end of the Civil War. From 1865 until 1964, 99 years, the filibuster is used 100% of the time to block civil rights legislation. 100% of the time. Then as the oligarchs took over, they started saying to the Republicans, well, why don't you use the filibuster to block, things that we don't like? And that's where we're at right now. We have two Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are throwing in with the oligarchs. I'm guessing that the reason why is because Manchin owes a lot of his political career to big coal in West Virginia, and they want to be able to filibuster to make sure that they can filibuster environmental legislation. Kyrsten Sinema owes a good chunk of her political career to the banking and real estate industries in Arizona. Same deal. You got a big industry here that wants to preserve the filibuster so their taxes don't go up or their regulations don't go up. And these two senators, Democratic senators, have said, we want to keep this racist relic of John C. Calhoun, the father of the Confederacy, on the books. We need to reach out to them. The phone number for the United States Senate switchboard where you can reach their offices is 202-224-3121. And I think one of the most important things we can do right now is get the filibuster gone, because there's a bunch. See, here's the problem. The most toxic poison to democracy is cynicism. And that's what the whole Reagan Revolution has been working toward, is making Democrats in particular, and now Americans more generally, cynical about their leadership so they don't participate in votes. As Paul Weyrich said in 1980, our leverage in the elections, when he was running the Reagan campaign, he said our leverage in the elections, quite frankly, goes up as the voting populace goes down. And if we don't break that cynicism cycle, if the Biden-Harris administration can't have some really serious, consequential, big successes in areas where there's more than 70% American approval, for example, ending student debt, more than 70% of Americans agree with that, and free college going forward. More than 70% of Americans want a national healthcare system that actually works, and single payer. If they can pull stuff like that off, then democracy has a chance and we can beat back oligarchy. If they can't pull it off, get ready for President Thom Hartmann or Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz in 2024, and they will pull off what Donald Trump was just too stupid to do. Wow. Okay. Well, I think everybody should have some sense by now why I'm so excited about you and your knowledge of this, and particularly this book. I think we need to turn this back over to our friends at Books and Books to open up for Q&A from all our visitors.
Fascinating conversation. Thank
Hey,
you.
Christine.
I just want to remind people watching, we have a few questions, but as we're answering them, you can go ahead and put in some more because we have a lot of people watching. So here's one. Thanks, Thom. Our regular guest on your excellent program is Professor Richard Wolff. He advocates replacing oligarchy, i.e. capitalism, with a small d democratic cooperative-based society. Time after time, oligarchs have gotten around the regulations implemented by Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, FDR's New Deal, Great Society, etc. So, time to dump oligarchy capitalism into the trash bin of history?
Yes. This is a conversation that Richard and I have had many times, I don't think that capitalism is the problem. I don't think you're going to ever get rid of. I've started 7 businesses in my life, 5 of them that were successful, one that was a flaming disaster, which I learned a tremendous amount from, and one of them, only one of them, did I have to go to somebody else to get money to start. But I did. I went to a guy, local wealthy guy, and said, I'll give you a percentage of the company if you'll give me some startup capital. And it was a very successful company. It was called International Wholesale Travel. It did business with Spurgery Travel in Atlanta, Georgia. Now it's done over $1 billion worth of business over the years. We sold it. Louise and I sold it after 3 years, but we got it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in 2 years as the fastest growing travel agency in the country. And I don't think that that's ever going to go away. People saying, I've got a great idea, but I don't have the means to make it happen. So if you look at capitalism like that, and I think of that really more as free enterprise, but that's really kind of the definition of capitalism. I don't think that's going to go away, and I'm not sure it should. But this monopoly capitalism that I wrote my last book about is toxic. It's democracy destroying, as well as middle class destroying and economy destroying, and needs to be regulated capitalism. And Richard's absolutely right. In fact, a book that I wrote more than a decade ago, or about a decade ago, called Threshold: The Crisis of Western Civilization. The book is now out of print, but there's still old used copies kicking around. The entire arc of that book was arguing that we need to go to worker-owner capitalism. The last chapter of the book, I went up to, I traveled all over the world, actually. Louise and I went to Spain, and we visited Mondragon, the largest worker-owned co-op in the world. At the time, it was a $56 billion cooperative with branches in dozens of countries. The CEO makes 4 times what their janitor makes. All the decisions are made collectively. It's just an amazing thing. I visited Peninsula Manufacturing, a tool and die shop up in Wisconsin that is owned by its employees. It was started that way. Visited Union Cab in Madison, and again, owned by its employees. This is Richard's hobby horse, his favorite thing, worker-owned co-ops. And I think that it is the best alternative to monopoly capitalism out there. And what we're seeing, and there's a few real advocates for this, like Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, Ron Wyden, Jeff Merkley. What we're seeing is that individual states, one at a time, slowly, it's been largely confined to blue states, are passing laws to create new kinds of corporations. In fact, the corporation that publishes my books and David's books, Barrett Kohler, that published this book, is a B corporation, a beneficent corporation. It's not entirely owned by its workers, but it's organized in a way that's quite different from a normal corporation. It's organized in a way to promote the public good. So we've got a big job to do there, but there actually are some great templates that we can follow. But again, it's going to take getting the oligarchs out of the political process.
Yeah, I just jump in to second that we can call it democratic socialism, or we can call it democratic capitalism, and it's more the definition. But
yeah, I think democratic capitalism actually is something that could fly, but as a slogan. Pardon my interrupting.
I often say that if private property is such a good thing, everybody should have some, and then that translates into exactly the kinds of cooperative ownership you're talking about.
Absolutely.
So here's another one. Thom, you seem to vilify the Republican Party much more than the Democratic Party, when both parties have been overrun by money corporate interests. How do you think we can move past this when the last several election cycles the Democratic Party has ignored the non-corporate left of the party? I know you keep saying that Biden-Harris are embracing more left positions, but their actions don't show that.
Well, I respectfully disagree. The Democratic Party brought us Medicare. The Republican Party fought it and continues to fight it. In fact, in 2005, the Bush administration passed Medicare Part C, Medicare Advantage, specifically to destroy Medicare. The Democratic Party brought us Medicaid. The Republican Party fights that. In red states, it's almost impossible to get on Medicaid, again, because of the dominance of the Republican Party. This is not stuff tinkering around the edges. The Democratic Party brought us child labor laws. The Republican Party fought them. The Democratic Party brought us the right to unionize. The Republican Party fought them. The Democratic Party brought us the minimum wage. The Republican Party said that that was unconstitutional. And in fact, they even got the Supreme Court to rule with them on that at one point. I am not here to be an apologist for the Democratic Party, but to, as I said before, cynicism is what poisons democracies. And when you look back at the messages that were being pushed out by Russian trolls in 2016, the principal message was there's no difference between the two parties. In other words, Democrats, don't bother to vote. It doesn't matter. Just go back to sleep. And of course, the Republicans were gung-ho to vote because they were being cranked up by their racist base and things like that. Yes, the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton, because Reagan destroyed the unions, we went from 1/3 of Americans having good union jobs when Reagan came into office to around 12% at the end of the Bush administration, if I'm remembering my numbers right. It's 6% in the private economy right now. Gutting the unions gutted the Democratic Party, and so you had the Clinton Revolution, as it were, where the Democratic Party started taking big corporate cash and looking for billionaire cash and Hollywood cash and all this other kind of stuff. That is receding. And it's still a force. It's still very much a power. And as I said earlier, as reflected by Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. But you're not going to find a Bernie Sanders in the Republican Party. You're not going to find a Sherrod Brown in the Republican Party, or a Ron Wyden, or a Jeff Merkley, or a Sheldon Whitehouse. These are good people who are fighting for actual democracy and actual economic justice. They literally don't exist in the Republican Party. There used to be some progressives in the Republican Party. You had Bob Packwood from Oregon. He got ultimately tripped up by his own sexual weirdness, but his policy positions were really good. There, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft back in the day, fighting the oligarchs, busting up Standard Oil and things like that. There is but they're gone. They were purged during the Reagan Revolution. So I don't like promoting this Russian meme in particular. Not specifically to Russia. The Saudis promote the same thing as well, in their bot contamination of Twitter. Oh, the two parties are just the same. I'm no fan of that. Sorry. David, you want to add anything to that?
Nope. That's
okay.
Okay, we'll do one more. Thom, I wish your hidden history books can become textbooks for our schools. My question is, how do I convince my liberal friends that Bernie Sanders is not actually radical?
Well, you just look at the opinion polls. I mean, there is no policy that Bernie Sanders advocates that doesn't have more than 50% popularity in the United States. Most of them are in between 60 and 90%. Literally, there is not a single policy Bernie is pushing that has below majority support. None. Not one. On the other hand, if you look at the policies the Republican Party is promoting, things like, let's get more tax cuts for the rich people. Let's not do anything to help people hit by COVID. You had, Senator Pat Toomey on Sunday on Jake Tapper's show on CNN say, not only should we not give $1.9 trillion to people in crisis, not only should we not give the $600 billion that Susan Collins and her 9 other friends went to the White House to pitch, let's just scale this back. We shouldn't give people anything. Screw them. Let them pull themselves up by their own damn bootstraps. Those policies have way less than 50% popularity. The real radicals are the people throughout the Republican Party who are promoting these things, and the few Democrats who are still taking these kind of positions, like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, that we really need to go along with the billionaires, and we really need to keep America safe for the corporations and the lobbyists, and you really just can't trust anything that has 50% popularity, because that's the rabble, don't you know? But honest to God, find a single policy that Bernie is promoting that is less than 50% popularity, and I'll send you an autographed book. You won't be able to find one.
Okay, so maybe we can sneak in one more question. Hi, recently on your show, you mentioned a statistic noting that in the 50s, working class was getting $28 an hour wages. Relative to today, we are currently aiming for $15 minimum. Should we be aiming for a higher percentage and return to the middle class of the 50s, or was that too much and disruptive, as the Kirk noted?
Yeah. Well, that $28 number, I talked about this on the program last Thursday, I think. In the 1950s, wages represented about 30% of worker productivity. Right now, the average worker produces about $70 worth of value for their employer. And the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So at the minimum wage, and we're talking about the minimum wage here, at the minimum wage, the average worker is costing their employer 10% of what they are making for their employer. The employer gets 90%, the worker gets 10%. In 1955, that number was 31%. The average worker was getting 31% of the value that they were producing for their employer. It slowly went down to in the late 60s, where it was in the 20s, in the low 20s, and of course right now it's around 10%. It's gone down radically since then. So if we were paying people a minimum wage that reflected worker productivity of the 1950s, the minimum wage right now would be about $30. It would be about 30 or 20, high 20s. I can't do math in my head that fast, but 27, 28, whatever 30% of $70 is. On the other hand, another way to look at it is, what was the purchasing power of the minimum wage in 1968? The purchasing power of the minimum wage in 1968 equates, there's different people offering different numbers depending on how they're doing their math and whether you're using CPI or some other measure of inflation. But somewhere between $17 or $18 an hour on the bottom end and $22, $23 on the high end was the purchasing power of the minimum wage back in the 60s. I put myself through college to the extent that I went to college, paid for an apartment, paid tuition, bought my books and everything, pumping gas and changing tires at the Esso station on Trowbridge Road in East Lansing, and working as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy. That was in 1968. So the things have changed in terms of the purchasing power of money, but the minimum wage hasn't much changed. And that's why I think we need to raise it. I don't know, David, you have an economics background and a PhD in this kind of stuff. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I do. But the thing I see goes far deeper as we get into an understanding of life. Life is basically matter that is resisting entropy through its labor. So in a very large context, basically all value to life comes through labor. And it's also true for human beings. To live well, we have to grow our food and harvest it and cook it, and we got to take care of the house and take care of the children. And this is all a form of labor, and we've partly gotten into the idea that in the ideal society we should not have to work. But we've also got into this idea that in our economics that the return should go to the people who hold money, to get their interest on their money, rather than the people who actually do the work. And it's another one of these pieces of just a screwing up of our mind and totally missing the point that the real returns from the economy should go to labor, which is also why labor should own their own means of living and production. That the idea of a separate ownership class is really something we've got to consign to the dustbin of history.
It's a remnant of the oligarchies of the 10th through 18th centuries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm 100% in agreement with the people who do the work should get the money.
There you are. There you are.
Definitely.
Bless you,
And I
Christine.
would, and this is a great conversation. I think we need a part 2. I think we really need to do this again. But seriously, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being part of our virtual series at Books and Books. I'll remind everyone watching that you can order your copy of the book by pressing the green button. It's as easy as that on the bottom of the screen, and we'll ship it right off to you. If you're in Miami, you can come by one of our stores and actually pick it up. So please order away. Don't hold back. Again, I want to thank you both for joining us. I hope to see you in person sometime soon, maybe in the fall. Thank you to all of our viewers watching from everywhere. And I want to know more about the true and deep democracy. I think that that is a beautiful thing to aim for.
David has some brilliant writings on that stuff.
I need to look some of those up.
Let's work on it. We certainly have another session at some point.
And were you able to see yourself?
No, I still don't
The
see it.
entire time?
I don't know what happened.
Okay, well, I'm very glad that we see you because you look really good.
I've got this section in the screen where I should be, and it's kind of a greenish color with a kind of a pattern.
Welcome to the world of virtual events.
Some kind of totem emblem in the middle.
So, Christine, thank you so much for hosting
so
us, and thanks so much.
It's wonderful to have you back with us again. We have always loved our events with you, both in person and virtual. Because I remember I was at the one at the store in Coral Gables. When was that? When would that have been? Like
years ago.
4 years ago, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you again. Good night, everybody.